Welcome, Jennifer, to the show. Glad to have you on. It sounds like you're doing some really interesting things with college students and recent college grads and a variety of people in the STEM industry, or at least that you call it an industry. But anyway, let's get there in a moment. Tell people about what you do, what your background is, and then let's dive into this conversation.
All right. Well, I'm really excited to be here. I am a leadership coach, and my story of how I got here is convoluted, but the short story is I was in consulting and working in a corporation for years. So I have my own personal leadership experience. And then I got put on a lot of different projects with STEM organizations, National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, some patient care health systems. And I discovered I really like working with that group of people. Super smart, very motivated, talented people who are going somewhere. And so I really started to focus on that. And then I had done a lot of leadership development programs, got introduced to coaching and thought, oh my goodness, this is what I want to be when I grow up. So I went to the Georgetown coaching program and I've been coaching like a crazy lady ever since. And I've continued to focus on STEM careers, people wanting to go into STEM careers. And I think now is a really good time to be talking to people who are maybe feeling a little out of place because of what's going on with the economy, maybe discouraged, or maybe just really wanting to prepare for what's next and what's going on.
Well, that's great. And for those who do not know the acronym STEM, and I don't even know whether I know all of them, it's science, technology, engineering, and
It's mathematics, and I include
okay.
Financial organizations in that. So I worked with a lot of like banking industries, economics, economists. I find they're all of a very similar mindset, very common challenges and needs.
Very analytical. So yeah. So what exactly do you help that? So if I'm a college student and I'm in one of these industries, I'm targeted, that's my major, or I'm somebody who's just been hired in one of those companies, what are typically the problems I'm running into that you're going to help me get through?
So I would say everyone who's listening, listen very carefully. Your challenge is not going to be your cognitive intelligence. You are smart and you are in a field where everyone around you is really smart too. So if you want to know what's going to be the critical factor in your success or non-success, it is going to be your emotional intelligence, your soft skills. That is what's going to move you ahead in your career. And unfortunately, it's one of those things that they don't even talk about in school. So people are just kind of thrown into the workforce trying to figure out what is all this stuff that nobody taught me about that I'm having to do in my job.
Well, this emotional intelligence, this great little name, or EQ, but what does that exactly mean?
So EQ it's all of those intangibles. It's how you feel about yourself. It's how you express yourself or choose not to. It's your working with other people, your interpersonal relationships. It's decision making and how you manage stress. So it's like all of these different components that sometimes we don't even put a label to, but are very much impacting your productivity, your tasks, and at the end of the day, the bottom line of the organization.
Well, let me play devil's advocate. So I'm a super smart person, which I'm not, but I'm one of these STEM people you're working with. And, I'm good. Okay. I know how to get from point A to point B, and I know how to figure out complex things. So why is this going to affect me at all? Because I can do these things, or I can do whatever's thrown at me. I'm smart.
Yes, I'm so glad you asked that because I get that a lot. And what it all comes down to is if you don't have respect in your organization, you are not going to get buy-in on your ideas. People are not going to want to work with you. And you might say, well, I don't care. Just put me in my little cubicle over here. I don't want to talk to anybody anyway. My husband's a mechanical engineer, and he's always saying, I just don't like people. But the thing is, if that's what you want, if you want to be an individual contributor for your whole career and you are happy doing that, that is awesome. if you see anything upward in your sights, you've got to be able to work with other people. You have to be able to build those relationships. You hear people joke around about all the business deals that are made on the golf course, and there's some truth to that. And you don't have to go out and learn golf, but you do have to be hanging out at the water cooler, so to speak, and let people know that you are interested in them and listen. If you don't, you are just going to get isolated. No one's going to really know what you bring to the table.
I know you're trying to be nice and you're saying, okay, if I'm a massive introvert and I just want to work in my cubicle, that's fine. But doesn't what you're talking about also affect them? Because ultimately they have to work with some other people and they have to get buy-in with certain things, or they have to be able to communicate well enough with other people or update people on time. They have to meet deadlines, whatever. It sounds like, based on my experience and what I'm hearing from you, that this emotional intelligence, or really building your soft skills, is important no matter where you are. If for nothing else, you just want less stress, because you can't hide in your cubicle. You're still going to have to interact with those people. And if you're not nice to them, they're not going to be nice to you.
That's true. And actually, working with your boss in and of itself is its own thing. In fact, some other time we'll have to do a podcast on managing up. That is a skill to learn for sure. And if your boss doesn't like you, then are you going to get the projects you want? Nope.
Yeah, that's what strikes me. If I'm, you're thinking, well, I can just do my own thing, but you'll get the lousy projects, whatever that may be, versus the good ones. So what are the biggest hurdles you run into? What are the biggest soft skills that you have to help people develop? I don't know whether you got some stories or whatever.
All right. Well, yes, I have plenty of stories, and I want to start out with talking about self-regard. That one I find to be critical with this group of STEM either new hires, managers, or college students, because there's two ends to that spectrum that I see, and I would say equally. So one end is not having enough self-regard, lacking confidence. And I started working earlier this year with a client who had been promoted to manager out of her group that she had been in. So she was promoted as a supervisor of her former peers. To make it even more complicated, two of her peers had applied for the same position. One was very supportive of, hey, glad you got it, good job. The other person was hostile and did everything he could to undermine her in meetings, very flippant in one-on-ones, always questioned her authority. And she's a very kind person, and I think felt bad about the situation, and that also got in the way of her really taking ownership of her role. So we worked together, and she was very motivated and very much wanting to do things differently. So we looked at her past successes, where are other times where she's been able to shine. And then we'd compare those times to the kinds of things she was doing now in her new role. And it didn't take long for her to see, hey, I deserve this job. I earned this job, and I have the skills and experience that I need to do it well. And something shifted internally, and it was really cool to be a part of that and to see this confidence that came. And once she felt confident in assuming this role, it wasn't hard for her at all to put this guy in his place and to really demand respect from him. And I think she didn't have to say a whole lot to him before he could identify the shift in her and the confidence, and got on board, became a team player. And it's been like 10 months now since she got promoted, and she is doing amazing things. She's just super happy, and the people side is going much more smoothly, and she can focus on her tasks, her projects, like the real work that she was excited about.
Awesome. So that's one side where they're low self-esteem. I assume the other side is they think they're the golden child, or they think too much of themselves.
Exactly. So let me tell you about a client I had who worked in a scientific organization. She went to an Ivy League school, and anybody who talked to her for longer than 2 minutes knew she went to an Ivy League school. And even though I knew she had gone to an Ivy League school, every meeting where we would interact, I mean, almost could have been a drinking game. How many times that she brought up this, where she went to school, and it drove everyone crazy. On top of it, she had a master's degree and she was very smart. And it felt like she always had to let everyone know how smart she really was. So she talked a lot at meetings. She was very quick to put her idea out there and shoot other people's down. And people tried saying things to her and she just didn't care. Well, this is who I am. Deal with it, which is something my mechanical engineering husband says sometimes. So it's easy to think, well, I'm super smart. I know how to do it right. So what's everybody else's problem? Well, she went through this for about a year. And by the end of the year, she realized nobody liked working with her. She wasn't getting involved in meetings and projects that involved a lot of collaboration. And I think she really had to hit that, rock bottom, so to speak, the pain became great enough for her that she started wondering, what do I need to do differently? And that's when you can start working with somebody. So Emily, she then started being more open to, okay, how do I need to change? And she got direct feedback on, you need to listen and recognize you've got all this academic experience, but you're surrounded in a room with people who have 10, 20, 30 years of real world experience. And so I think it hadn't occurred to her that she didn't know everything. And she started taking a seat back and listening more. So at a meeting, listening to background information, what had been tried before, what was being done now, what were some of the successes and failures, what are questions that people had. And as she shifted from wanting to be the person who was talking all the time to somebody who was listening, she started seeing, oh, there are some different ways to look at this, or, oh, the way I would handle this would be so different if I know all this background information. And it didn't happen overnight. It was like a few years of her learning to have more empathy and dial back her arrogance to being more of assertiveness. And I'm happy to say it's now been, 15 years. And she is in a management position, leading teams and doing awesome things. But she absolutely wouldn't have gotten there had she not learned to put her ego aside.
Interesting. So sometimes in our industry, you and I both coaching with leaders, I get asked, Dave, sometimes I can't figure out whether you're my therapist or my coach. And maybe I'm going to go down a rabbit trail you don't want to go. But I'm curious, for what I've found is in my life is a lot of people can't deal with that stuff. Either deal with the low self-esteem or deal with the whatever ego, thinking too highly of themselves because they really don't understand themselves well enough yet. And they're not open to really looking at that. You bring up this woman just now that finally she had a point. It's just like something opened, a barrier was removed and she could look at, why is this happening? What am I doing? Versus the victim mentality, it's all them. So I'm curious, do you find, this might help some of our listeners if you want to go in this direction. Do you find some yellow flags, red flags that indicate, oh, this is what's triggering the person's low self-esteem or overabundance of ego or overconfidence based on their life experience? Do you find that? And what are those kind of yellow flags or red flags for somebody who's not there yet? But if they hear these things, they may think, oh yeah, I do think that way. And maybe that's negatively affecting me.
All right. So I would say a major flag is thinking that you know all there is to know. And if you don't have respect for the people who've been in your organization longer than you have, it's really unfortunate actually right now in our society, there's been a lot of joking about the different generations, but I think more and more it's getting accusatory and the whole okay boomer thing, that if that's truly how you feel about that baby boomer generation, wow, you're going to have a really hard time in the workforce. Because let me tell you, that baby boomer generation is the one that they've built up these organizations. They've gotten to where they have in leadership because they're amazing people. So think about your attitude towards other people in higher up positions who are older than you, who've been at a company longer. And if you find yourself not having a whole lot of respect for that group, that's a big flag.
It's interesting, if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're saying is we have to really process how we think about other people. So if we don't respect them, we need to ask ourselves why. If we think we're smarter than them, we need to think why. If we think they're smarter than us, we need to ask, why am I thinking that?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, because otherwise we've set a barrier on ourselves. You talk about the glass ceiling there, we put the glass ceiling and we manage it. We keep it in place because we have some partial truths probably that we've exaggerated a certain way, or a wound from our life, even if it was well-intentioned. By that, I mean, I was raised as, kind of the golden child, where my parents thought out of 3 kids, I'd be the one who could do anything. And it actually worked out to be a big negative. They meant it very lovingly, but it worked out to be a wound because it made me believe things about myself that were not true. I'm not that smart person that's in the STEM program. So that's very interesting. So it sounds like part of your work is helping people understand these belief systems that they have and how it's affecting them relationally with others.
Yes. And another flag is if your family of origin was one where you didn't feel like you had much of a voice, maybe all the decisions got made for you. You're the middle child and you were known as the peacekeeper between your older and younger sibling. Like you came from a really big family. And there are a lot of reasons why sometimes people grow up feeling like, well, my opinion doesn't matter. And one of two things happens there. It goes to the low self-regard, where then people are apologetic about making requests and come off kind of like spineless, actually. And then you have the other end where you become more arrogant. Well, I didn't get listened to my whole growing up. People are going to listen to me now. And they overcompensate, going to that extreme. So you're right. There's kind of a fine line sometimes between coaching and therapy. The difference would be, of course, a therapist would dig down and get to the healing and origin of how that happened. With coaching, we acknowledge it. Oh, yeah, my mom was really harsh and only gave me negative feedback. And so I grew up thinking I couldn't do anything right. And then as a coach, I would say, okay, it's good to know you've got that voice in your head, because now we're going to figure out how to manage it.
Yeah. And what about people of color? What about, particularly when George Floyd was murdered by the cop, and nobody resuscitated him. People stood around, took videos and posted it to social media, although some people were voicing some concerns. It was kind of a wake-up call for me. I've never thought of myself as racist, but it was a wake-up call for me to dig deeper and try to understand, okay, what does a Black person have to go through, particularly like in a STEM program, okay? Mm-hmm. Where I would think in a STEM program, you have the best students. These students may be white, they may be Asians. Asians often have a very good discipline in school, right? Indians, you may have some other people. What about people of color and what things they have to deal with this self-esteem thing, or you didn't call it self-esteem, but self-regard. And what are you seeing there, and what should they kind of be aware of as positives and negatives, positives they can build on, and negatives that they're like, oh, maybe this is not affecting me in a good way?
So good question. And I think particularly with the Black community, that there are a lot of ties maybe where they're feeling pulled back to and judged by other African-American people. Like, you've sold out the negative words they have for someone who's living a life like a white person, but they're Black. And that's so incredibly unfortunate that I hate that there's a culture that might get in the way of a Black person really owning what they're capable of and their talents. And, I'm going to go make something of myself, even if it's not the way like all my friends back home would do it. Also, I think it's hard because if you're a person of color, it's like you have to work that much harder because you don't want anybody to think you got your job just because you're a minority. I think you have to always be fighting that stigma. So I do think it brings a lot of complications. And then with the different cultures, it's really interesting how there's some stereotypes, and sometimes they're very accurate and sometimes they're not. And so, you're walking around having to prove yourself all the time. I see that also with women in STEM. It's a very male-dominated industry. And so I find a lot of women get labeled very unkind names. So we'll keep this family appropriate because they are assertive. And then you do get women who go over the top because they are compensating for a lack of confidence. It's messy. It is. And all I have to say is, the more you can let go what you feel like people might be labeling you as or judging you as, and you show people what you can do. You demonstrate your capabilities. You work on being the best person you absolutely can be. And it might take time, but people will see you as you and not define you by the color of your skin or your gender.
Well, it sounds like also that separate of the racial, potential racial issues, that when we get back to the EQ, when we know ourselves better, then we're going to be able to develop stronger relationships with others. And really what a big part of what's going to drive our career are those relationships, regardless of the color of skin or ethnicity of the other people. And hopefully we can develop some diversity in that. But please talk more about what these STEM students or recent college graduates, and they're in there, or maybe they've been leaders for a while, they're still in the STEM industry. But what should they be aware of that are common to the industry that it relates to EQ? You brought up Selfregard, the high and the low end. What else should they be looking out for that may be holding them back? Or quite frankly, as you just said, that somebody misbehaves. And instead of attacking or withdrawing, fight or flight, I think, wow, why did that person behave that way? I wonder what they've gone through, type of thing. So what type of things should they be aware of?
So what you just described is empathy. And I think of all the different emotional intelligence components, that one I get the most eye rolls. Empathy, and my husband often, Mr. Mechanical Engineer, he'll just say, well, why? It's not my job to take care of other people. They should take care of themselves. Or, why do I have to word things a certain way? And you know what? On one hand, that concept is absolutely right. People need to take care of themselves, and that is not your job. That said, that is the best way to develop real, authentic relationships with others is to have that empathy. So to be able to maybe we have a Black college student and a white college student, both men, who are trying to apply for jobs. And it might be that the white person looks at the Black individual and says, well, you are going to get more job offers than I am because you're a minority. And then the other person's like, oh, you have an unfair advantage because you're a white man. And are they, who's right, who's wrong? It doesn't matter because they have perceptions. But if you can pause and take a step back and try to see what it could be like from the other perspective, then it often helps things make more sense. And then you can find common ground and a place to connect with other people. If you can't have empathy and if you can't develop a healthy collaborative relationships in the workplace, like how in the world are you going to be able to problem solve the really big problems that are going to take more than just your brain to fix?
Yeah, and it's interesting in your example, depending on the organization and the hiring manager, both of them are right. In certain cases, the white person is going to have an advantage. In certain cases, the black person is going to have an advantage. And in certain cases, the option they didn't mention, neither of them will have an advantage. Hopefully a growing number of cases where people won't look at the color of their skin or their ethnicity, whatever, and go from there. So you've got so keep going, please, because I'm curious. You mentioned the self-regard, you mentioned empathy, but what are the other issues when you got these super smart people who can solve anything, but maybe their people skills aren't as good? What's another one that's high on the list that you see?
So I would say related to those interpersonal relationships, I worked with an individual, very smart, at an organization that if I said, you would absolutely recognize the name. And when I went for our first coaching session, it was 90 minutes long. And I'm pretty sure he talked for about 88 of those minutes. Literally, I had to be rude and interrupt him to get barely a word in edgewise. And I thought, okay, well, maybe he just wanted to make sure I knew a lot about his background and that this was helpful. So I didn't say anything. We went to the next session. Same thing. He talked the whole time. And finally, then on the third time, when I saw, okay, there's a pattern here, I stopped him and I said, and I just was factual. And I said, it's been really interesting to come here and note that of our time together, you've talked about 95% of the time. And he sat back and he said, I have. And he was completely unaware that he'd been doing all the talking. And even funnier, he's like, yeah, well, I thought these sessions have been going great. Well, here's someone who likes to hear himself talk. And that's what we spent probably most of our time together working on. Is it's not about you just spewing and spouting off your ideas or your goals or your view on the world, but it's a two-way conversation. It's listening. And I know I said that earlier, but it really is so important. People want to feel heard. People want to feel listened to. And you know what it's like when you want to say something and then people cut you off and they keep on, and they make assumptions or whatever. Like, it's really frustrating when we feel like somebody doesn't want to hear what we have to say. So that's something to look at. Are you a talker? And if you are, that's fine. I'm a talker. I have my two biological kids talk nonstop, and they're 5 and 3. At some point, you have to learn how to manage that so that it's not too much for other people and that you're not just loving listening to the sound of your own voice.
Yeah, I don't know who said it. Some great leader said, great leaders ask great questions. So that's really the connecting point. And interesting. So let's go back to what are the types of things that the STEM type people do that offend other people?
Thinking that there's one right answer. I would say that will rub so many people the wrong way.
They know it.
Oh, yeah. They know it. There's one right answer, and this is it. And then when someone tries to push back, and no, like, this is it. And just being so closed-minded that there could be a possibility for another way to do it. That is a big turnoff for other people. And one thing that your college students might not have thought about is you not only are going to be working with other STEM people. So sometimes you get off easy when you're working in a group of other people who think just like you do. Sometimes, nobody wants to have any chit chat and let's just get to the task and boom, 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 and you're done. But a lot of times you're going to be interacting with other groups. My husband works for a manufacturing company. He's a designer, an engineer, and he has to work with marketing people. He works with HR, with different recruiting and hiring events. He works with people who are actually building the things that are created. And all these people think differently. They have different goals in mind. They have different backgrounds, different education. And you've got to figure out how to get, again, it's that finding that common ground and how to work together and respect that while you have your own agenda of the things that are important, there's a bigger picture and there are other things on that important agenda too.
Well, it's interesting because it sounds like, if I'm understanding you correctly, the STEM mind thinking that there's one way and it's my way or the highway is that if they can adapt and learn that the other person may not be totally right, but they may have a piece of the puzzle that they're missing or an ingredient to the recipe they're missing. And the way to find out is not to put up a wall and butt heads, but to start asking questions. There's a guy, Greg Kokel, who does actually ministry stuff, and he talks about using the Columbo questions from the old Columbo TV show. And he says, so you start out by just saying, oh, really, what do you mean by that? Or, oh, you have a different view. I didn't come to that conclusion. So tell me more about that. What do you mean? And then he adds only one other one. It's just like, well, why do you believe that's true? Or why do you believe that's right? And then he kind of leaves it there for him because that's what he's trying to do. He's just trying to plant a seed. But in a dialogue between two coworkers, peers, or project team members, if you ask questions, it actually is an opportunity for you to improve what you're doing, for you to get smarter, and as you indicated earlier, to build that relationship with the other individual because you're showing them that respect.
Exactly. And one thing, as you've been talking, it reminds me that most of the STEM people I've known are very decisive people. As far as personality types, they tend to make decisions quickly. I'm that way as well. It's probably one reason why I get along well with that group of people. But what I have found is when you are so confident and so quick to make decisions, you often make a hasty decision or you make a decision where you didn't know all the facts. And so a tip that I like to give my clients is when you're in a meeting, especially when you're in a meeting full of a lot of people who think like you, instead of being like, all right, let's make this meeting as short as possible, just bam, it can be helpful to give yourself like, okay, we're thinking about, changing the project plan. We're going to get a different kind of software, whatever it might be. Allocate some time to do brainstorming. And so if you're in an hour-long meeting about a decision that needs to be made by the end of that hour, I would say devote half of that time thinking about what are the possibilities, what are the pros and cons, are there any options that we haven't considered, what are competitors doing, and really being thorough, getting all the data that you need. And then you can spend the second half then narrowing down options, prioritizing what the criteria are going to be for the decision that you end up making. And I found that to be a really helpful trick to keep that in check.
Yeah, and I find that, and I've learned this the hard way myself, being a decisive person. One of the things I need to do is I need to slow myself down at the front end of that meeting, like you say, and say, okay, what can go wrong if we go in this direction? Because I'm already looking at, okay, we do this, and then we're going to go to that, and then we're going to go to that. But what if I'm wrong on one of those steps? So what can go wrong is a piece. I'd also like you to, and we need to wrap up pretty soon, but I want to hear from you. You're talking about these decisive people, these drivers, these people. What about the other people? And this may, going back to, if we think of someone who is a Black person or another heritage who has not gotten a fair shake in their life, can be a white person too, but and has been, although they're incredibly smart and they're there, they got a seat at the table, so at the STEM table, so they are incredibly smart, but they've been beat up so bad, they don't have that self-confidence. You talked about the self-regard early on. So what can they do when they're hearing what people are saying and they're thinking, this is wrong, but they don't necessarily have the confidence to speak up about it? What's a way that they can speak up without feeling like they're going to be threatened or attacked? Or if they are, that they can handle it based on the way that they're raising their concern?
I have 3 words: data, data, data. And the really great thing about working with the STEM organizations is data is paramount. So whether it's, one of the situations you described, or somebody who just feels intimidated for whatever reason by the room, or maybe you're making a request of your boss and you don't know how to say it. You put the emotions to the side and you go to the data. So let's say you hear an idea and you think this is a terrible idea. Sometimes we come up with that reaction based on our intuition, and sometimes it's a logical thought. If it's your intuition that comes up first, then just pause and think about, okay, what thought did I have that is giving me this gut feeling? And once you can drive it to the data, then people will listen and respect, because it's not your opinion, it's data. For example, I one time was in a recruiting situation where we did a bunch of interviews all in one day, round robin style. And at the end, we were trying to decide who to narrow it down to for job offers. And there was this one gentleman who had come across very articulate, very positive, team player, said all the right things. There was just something nagging at me. And I actually, when everybody else was like, yeah, let's put this guy on the hiring list. And I said, I just don't feel good about it. And someone else looked at me and like almost leapt out of her chair. What do you mean you don't feel good about it? And I'm like, hang on, because my intuition talks first. And so I had to pause, and I looked back to this person's resume and just took a deep breath and just said, just give me a second. And I looked again, and I noticed this person's work experience, all of his dates. He had never been at a job longer than like 8 months for the last, 8 years or something crazy. And I said, if you see that once or twice, you can imagine scenarios. But if that's like, do we really want to invest all this time and energy into onboarding somebody and he's going to leave in 8 months? And why do you think he keeps leaving? And once I could point out data on the resume, I mean, just like that, everybody's, oh my gosh, you're absolutely right. Next candidate. Yeah. So yeah, you got to be all about the data.
Yeah. And I teach hiring. That's the first thing I teach, is how to read a resume. And I totally agree with you. And it sounds like, if I'm understanding you correctly, what you're saying is that you ask a question. So you don't challenge the data necessarily, because then you might get into a duel, you might get into a battle, but you can ask a sincere, empathetic, watch your tone of voice question about the data or the missing data. Oh, do we have data on this? No, we don't have data on that. Oh, well, if we had data on that, wouldn't that help us be able to better ascertain this? How can we get that data? Can I help get that data? And just help them and try to plant some seeds, using Greg Kokel's term. And that can help you in a way to get your point across, have a voice. And over time, if you're on the right team, they'll start to respect you more and involve you more. If you're on the wrong team, you'll learn some really good skills, but then get to another team.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, don't ever feel trapped. But I like how you said, give it some time, because sometimes you don't know which way it's going to go.
Yeah, and sometimes you just need to let up. And the people that are more senior, you say what you have to say, and you let them win. And if it doesn't work out and you're right, you never say, I told you so. And you just continue to be encouraging, positive, and work through that. So it sounds like you have this unique specialty of working with people in the STEM industry, including some college graduates. I keep pulling them in because I want to see more of them. And I want to see more people. particularly people of color, Blacks, Hispanics in particular for me. And there's other races too that are important, but succeed in the STEM industry. So if people want to learn more about what you're doing, Jennifer, how do they find out more about you, maybe contact you?
Thank you. My website is, oh, my mind just blanked. Sorry. My website is ambitionleadership.com. And if you go to my homepage, you will see an offer that I'm making for your audience. And for just $99, you can get an emotional intelligence assessment and then a debrief session with me where we can look at strengths, areas for development, the interrelationships with different EQ. And when sometimes people are like, well, how am I supposed to go about developing more empathy? I can actually give you ideas for exercises that you can do that as you practice them will over time help you improve in those areas.
Well, that's awesome, because that's what I love with assessments, is that the key is not the assessment. The key is, okay, what did I learn from this that I'm going to apply? So I'm so happy to hear that closing out that meeting, and you did that with me. You had me take your assessment, which was interesting, and you gave me some ideas, and that's great. So I want to thank you very much for being on the show. I think this is helpful for our audience, and hopefully there's some people out there in the STEM industry, or they know somebody. Send this to somebody you know that's in STEM, and they might find something here that can help them.
Wonderful. I really appreciate being a guest and hope that some of the tips and stories will resonate with your audience and help them know how they can be ready to be really successful in their career.